pioneer of, just getting the truth out there on cannabis and hemp seed for a long time. On you, Doc. Thanks for coming.
Will I hold the microphone? Put it on there.
No, I think just hold it.
Do you want to have a...
Speak right into it.
Yeah. All right, good morning. Good morning, everyone. What I'm going to do for this hour, or part of it at least, is just give you an account of what's happened to me in the last 2 years, and how we're going to use that to go forward, because the only thing that really matters is a strategy to go forward. At this stage there's a lot of potential energy, but it hasn't been converted into kinetic energy, which is action. Okay, what's happening in November, the court case was actually originally planned 2 years ago. We were dismayed by the lack of progress that's being made just with ordinary moral arguments. You should do this because it's the right thing to do, and such moral arguments have really got us no traction whatsoever with the political forces in this country. They actually operate in a morals-free zone as far as I'm concerned. So, you know, we can do street demonstrations. We don't really have the media on side, so we can't build up a big head of steam that way. So we decided we had to use the courts as a weapon to advance the case of medical cannabis, and the plan was to run a medical necessity defence. Now, necessity defences are very suppressed by the legal profession generally, because they like to be in control of what they do. A necessity defence says that you are breaking a law because there is greater good accruing by breaking the law than by not breaking the law. All right? Now, anything that involves a threat to the legal status quo is usually opposed by the courts, and there's been a lot of resistance to the judges even accepting necessity defences in court. So what I did 2 years ago, we actually researched what they call the elements of necessity defence. And it turns out when you look at legal history in this country, it was discussed a lot more openly 20 and 30 years ago, and those precedents still stand. Long story short, there are 3 elements to a successful medical necessity defence. The first one is there has to be an immediate threat to life or health. Now, with medical cannabis, especially when it applies to children with intractable epilepsy, and by choosing children with intractable epilepsy, I'm not putting one group of suffering people above any other group. Everyone who suffers any symptoms, even as little as an ingrown toenail, is still worthy of the same sympathy. But in medico-legal terms, the epileptic children demonstrate within the elements of a necessity defence the correct approach, right? So the first element is there has to be an immediate threat to harm. We have documented cases of children that have had prolonged periods of status epilepticus. That means seizures with no breaks in between. The longest one in one of our young patients was nearly 3 weeks of unrelieved seizures, and in that time she lost about 4 years of developmental skills. Right? So you've got an 8-year-old going back to a 4-year-old's level, and then it's a very, very slow and long crawl back up the hill to get back even to 8, let alone 12. So we have an immediate benefit to be judged. The next thing is there has to be no reasonable alternative to breaking the law in order to do what you're doing. And in the cases that I'll be presenting, we have documentation from some of the most senior neurological doctors in this country saying that they'd done all in their power to help these little children and there was nothing more to do. So they'll be damned by their own clinical notes in this instance. The third element of necessity is that the act of breaking the law has to be proportional to the amount of good that's being done. And I think I won't find it very difficult to convince 12 reasonable people, or even just 12 sane people, if we can find them, and I'm sure we can, that growing a little tent or a patch in the backyard of medical cannabis and extracting it in a chemical-free way and giving it to a child is proportional to the benefit. So, despite the naysaying of just about every legal practitioner that I've spoken to over the last 2 years, I actually expect to win. Right? The court case will start on November the 5th and it'll run for 2 weeks. Now, we would like some public attendance on the first day. The reason for that is if we can fill a courtroom with silent witnesses, it will attract much more public scrutiny of what's going on. There'll be enough controversial statements made in the court to attract news, but it's very difficult to anticipate the depth of control that the media has and the way they bend and twist stories in this country. So whilst we hope to get fair reporting, we can't absolutely rely on it. However, I think I've done my homework enough to run a successful medical necessity defence. Now, where will that take us, you might ask? I like to think one successful medical necessity defence does two very important things. Firstly, it enshrines in modern law in the 21st century a reinforcement of the principles, the elements of a necessity defence. And secondly, it empowers the next jury. Once they've seen one jury give a not guilty verdict with a clear conscience and a happy heart, it will be much easier for the second one to do it. We see that all the time in human endeavour. I don't know when the 4-minute mile was first broken, I think in the 50s or 60s. It took years and years and years for the first human to run more than a mile in 4 minutes. But yet after that, there was 8 records broken in a few months. You know, there is an element of empowerment. And what we want to do here is empower the public to speak truthfully. That's all we're asking. So when I ask the jury to give me a not guilty verdict because what I did was medical necessity, hopefully it won't only be that jury, but the next one and the next one. And eventually, even the New South Wales Police may stop criminal prosecution against medical suppliers, because that's what this is all about. We cannot, and it's been demonstrated regrettably too many times, we cannot rely on the New South Wales government to supply medical cannabis. Right? There are a few little trials going on, but some of the epileptic children that were relying on me and others for supplies are now having to buy Canadian cannabis well over $1,200 a month to keep a child seizure-free. Some of the Epidiolex results are a little disappointing as well. So we have children that were doing very well on our fresh whole plant extracts, and now even on much larger doses of Epidiolex, they're not controlled at all. And in fact, I'll be presenting one of these cases during the trial. Now, just to let you know how this system works in this country, for the last 20 years I've been ranting on and on about how we live in a police state. But I'll tell you what, up until the last 12 months, that was more theoretical than practical. But in the last 12 months, it's become very practical. This is what happened to me. I was originally arrested in June of last year, where they raided the house at St Ives in Sydney. They had 12... The idea there, as part of the plan, was I'd been extracting the last crop of cannabis. We had about 10 kilos of cannabis, and we were extracting that, and we'd already sent off most of the oil to the patients, but we kept all the used leaf, the extracted leaf, and went on TV, I think in May, and actually showed the buckets of cannabis to the television cameras, and they knew where it was, so we expected a police interdiction, which is what we got. We had 12 police turn up, 3 of them with door hammers ready to smash down the door, dressed in the thug gear with the tasers and the whole lot. Anyway, I was carted off to Hornsby lockup, and 12 police spent the next 12 hours ripping the house apart. Right? Unfortunately, they found my stash of medical oil that I kept at the bottom of the freezer. I didn't think they would look there, and that put me into a category called show cause for bail. There's different categories in this country, right? The majority of people who are arrested, as long as it's a non-violent crime and there is no risk of ongoing harm to someone, there's an argument in favour of bail, and unless there's particular reasons, you're granted bail until your court case is coming along. Bearing in mind there's much more than a 12-month delay between being charged and coming to court in this country, sometimes much longer. There is an atrocious backlog. Now, for those that are arrested and not given bail, you stay in what you call a remand jail. Remand means you're in jail, you haven't been convicted of anything, and the default situation is you go to a maximum security jail. Right, a maximum security jail. Now, half of the jails in this country are privatised. Now, in June, because I was only charged with 10 kilograms of leaf, it wasn't a show cause. That's called commercial supply. But when they discovered the oil and later had it analysed, it sort of took me up to a higher category called large commercial supply, and that's a show cause for bail refusal. So in December of last year, they made what they call a detention application, where the DPP applies to the court to have the person who is on bail arrested and incarcerated, because the charges are now higher, right? Upgrading your charges. Now, it turns out the definition of cannabis oil, and listen to this carefully because these are meant to be made by scientifically literate people, the definition of cannabis oil is any liquid containing any amount of THC. Right? You got that? Any liquid containing any amount of THC. So say you make a pot of tea, say it's, for argument's sake, a litre, and you put, say, 3 grams of cannabis in that, and you're busted for that, you can go to jail for 15 years because that's called 1,000 grams of cannabis oil. Right? Just, I kid you not, any liquid containing any amount of THC. So because the oil I was using at that stage, we were using a sonicated process, and the average volume of the oil we made was 250 mils, the idea then was to have doses of 3 to sort of 6 mils as a dose, because there's less room for error when you're dosing a small child. If you're dealing with drops, you can double the dose very easily. But if you're dealing with larger volumes, so I was making an oil with between 4 and 5 milligrams a mil, so each bottle had just over a gram of cannabis in, and there was, I don't know how many there was about 30 or something like that. So by rights, I should have been charged with 30 grams of cannabis, because that's what it was. Instead, I was put it into the absolute highest category, large commercial supply, manufacture and ongoing supply, and I was whisked away to Parkleigh Jail. Parkleigh's a privatised jail. For those who might have heard the story that life in jail is a holiday, it's not, right? It's not at all. Now, I don't like to make critical comments about prison guards, but people ask me what the guards were like, and I said if you took a thug and crossed it with a moron, that would come close to what they are at the moment. Now, to be fair to them, they're people of limited IQ, because people with better brains do better jobs than that, and they are largely shaped by the environment, by the zeitgeist of where they are. I'll give you an example. Has anyone here heard of the Millgate experiment that was done in the 60s? Done by a professor of psychology. There's been several done, but what he did basically, he got paid actors to be either experimenters in white coats with clipboards or to be the victim on the bed. And they took random college students, that's picked randomly, and solely because they were told to by an experimental authority with a white coat, they could easily induce more than 90% of them to administer electric shocks to these people, even though they could see they were writhing around in pain and crying out for mercy. 90% could be easily coerced into torturing their fellow man. Now, at the end of the experiment, Millgate was heard to say, before I did this experiment, I wondered where the Nazis could get enough people to stock their concentration camps to run them. He says, after I've done the experiment, I realised they could pick them up in the average American suburban block. Right? And that's what I have to say about the prison guards. Right? People of limited IQ in an economically challenged world, and they very, very rapidly fall into step. Right? And unfortunately, it's a race to the bottom. So the mean, tough-spirited individual pushes the average care down. Any act of kindness or generosity or understanding is almost frowned on. Not almost frowned on, it is frowned on. and the thing just spirals down. Okay. I only spent 2 months in Parklea, and just to give you an idea of the conditions there, hey, listen, Sista, I don't know if you can get access to YouTube, but if you could get Billy Bragg's song, Rotting on Remand, anyone heard that song? We'll play that after I finish speaking. You should be able to get it on YouTube, Rotting on Remand. I mean, I like Billy Bragg as an artist, and I listen to this song because it's got great sort of poetry and stuff like that. But then I realised I was actually living it, right? And you wait till you hear the song, it's exactly as he sings it. Now, Parklea is now a privatised jail. It was originally full of what they call 1 out for 1 person, or 2 out for 2 people. The cells are 5 by 2 metres, or 5 by 3 metres in size. And what they did in the last few years, they bolted another metal bunk into each of them, so the 1-off became a 2-off, and the 2-off became a 3-off, but the walls didn't get any further apart. So I basically spent, after a week in solitary confinement for giving cheek or something like that, I spent the rest of the 2 months in a concrete box, 5 by 3 metres with 3 people, right? An open toilet and a shower included in that 5 by 3 metres, no access to natural sunlight. The minimum time you're incarcerated was 23 hours a day. 23 hours a day. If there was a staff shortage and enough people didn't turn up, you were just left in. Your hour was cancelled. You could spend 1, 2 or 3 days on what they call lockdown. If there was a fight maybe in one of the back corners, the whole pod would be locked down for 1, 2 or 3 days, right? So you're spending... One thing that I have to say on the positive side, the ingenuity of the prisoners is unbelievable. The way they move the drugs around the prison is just unbelievable. The amount of drugs in the prison, I mean, it's a cliche to say it's full of drugs. It's overflowing with drugs. Most of them allopathic prescription drugs. Buprenorphine is by far the most common drug in jail. Bub, as they say, a Suboxone, if you know. It's a combination of a narcotic, a synthetic narcotic, and a bit of naltrexone to reduce some of the side effects. Anyway, it comes pouring in through the visits, it comes pouring in over the walls, the guards bring it in, staff smuggle it in. There wasn't a day where obvious bub smoking wasn't taking place, and only by massaging your cellies over time you could sort of pick and choose and move between the cells. You eventually get a drug-free cell, right? Because I've got nothing against people using drugs if they must, but they're fucked to deal with when they run out, I'll tell you that. Right? I mean, spending 3 days by yourself is much better than by someone hanging out for their bub for 3 days. It's not very nice at all. Anyway, I made a bail application. I had to wait 2 months for it, and I managed to convince Judge Syme, the district court judge, that I wasn't a threat to society. It turns out the DPP, the Department of Prosecutions, made a big deal of the findings of the HCCC. The HCCC are the Healthcare Complaints Commission. Have you heard of that lot? They're amongst the top 10 disreputable organisations in the universe as far as I'm concerned, and there's a lot of very, very fierce competition for those top 10 spots. Anyway, the HCCC, on the basis of a medical cannabis experiment myself and the church did, we had 2 ladies with near-terminal ovarian cancer, and it was obvious to me from my experience in the past of dealing with the cancer problem in cannabis that no amount of oral or inhalational cannabis was going to impact. These people had a cancer that was walled off to the outside world and very difficult to access therapeutic doses of cannabis into it. So in an act of desperation, scientifically, we injected the cannabis into the acidic fluid of the cancer because we had no other strategies that had any prospect whatsoever of saving them. Now, before I did this, I wanted to have the oil tested to be assured that what we were getting was a 50-50 blend of THC and CBD. Now, the reason I did this was, firstly, the evidence is indicating that that may have a much more profound anti-cancer effect by a synergism between the two things. But more importantly, if we're going to inject it, see, when you eat or smoke cannabis, you only absorb a tiny proportion of it. It might be as low as 5%, it can be as high as 20% with vaporising, but it's still only a tiny amount of the total dose you actually absorb. But if you inject it, the whole lot's in there. So I was concerned, very concerned, that if we injected a THC dose of some magnitude, the victims or the patients would have a very profound negative psychotropic experience, and that would interfere with the therapeutic process. So I took the oil along to Sydney University and spoke to Professor Ian McGregor, who I've known now for nearly 30 years, and I asked Ian, I said, look mate, ladies are dying, just test the oil. We haven't got our little chromatography units at the moment. We'd run out of reagents, so we couldn't test it ourselves. Just quickly run it through your machines, and I can proceed with this experiment with much more confidence. Ian agreed. He said, yeah, that's worthwhile. He said, how do I do it? With what paperwork? And I said, just put in an application for a 23(4)B licence to the Chief Health Officer, and because you're an established research university, there shouldn't be a problem. Day later, he said, oh, I rang them. He said, absolutely, I've been prohibited from having anything to do with you and cooperating in any way. The Chief Health Officer's name's Kerry Chand. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I went back to the ladies and told them, look, I'm very uncomfortable injecting you with this oil because we don't have an analysis. And correctly, both of them said, where are we going anyway? So I said, please go ahead. So we proceeded with the experiment. Now, we injected the oil, and as it turned out, when we finally got the analysis from the specimens we'd sent away to the United States a long time later, it was 100% THC. The supplier had actually lied to us quite comprehensively. And I'll tell you what, if you get something like about 5 grams of pure THC parenterally into your system, these ladies had a profound negative psychotropic experience, as you can imagine. Right? We nursed them through it for 3 days, but we didn't really have the resources to continue, so I ended up having both of them admitted to hospital, simply for intravenous fluids and support. They weren't sick, they were just not there. Right? Okay. Again, long story short, the jaws of the registrar at John Hunter Hospital, when I wrote in the notes what I'd done, I mean, I had to sort of pick it up off the floor, really. But, and this is important, one of the patients is still alive, and this was done more than 3.5 years ago. The other patient experienced a 50%, a halving of her cancer markers in the 3-week follow-up test. So one of them is still alive, and the other one had a halving of her cancer markers, which would approximately correlate to a halving of the volume of cancer, right? But then her family sort of gathered around in some protective sort of corral and insisted she go back to chemo, and she died 4 months later under chemo, right? The HCCC went to, before she died obviously, went to both the patients and insisted that they make a complaint about me. Right? They actually pressured the 2 women to make a complaint about me, but one of them, rather than make a complaint, actually nominated me for Australian of the Year, and I actually got shortlisted. It's a mad world, mate. It's a mad world out there. Anyway, the other one wouldn't make a complaint, so guess who made the complaint? Kerry Chand, the Chief Health Officer, who refused Ian McGregor permission to test the oil, then went on to make a complaint. And despite the testimony of the women supporting what we'd done and making it very clear they'd more or less insisted we do what we did, right, they found that I was this is the words they used, I was a menace to society, and I went round injecting people with massive doses of cannabis. Right? I mean, it really was a bizarre intentional misinterpretation of what's going on. But during the bail hearings, they made a big deal about I was a menace to society, and the reason I should be locked up is that I wouldn't drag random women off the street and inject them with cannabis. Right? We're dealing with some very, very, very disturbed people. Anyway, I convinced this judge, district court judge, that I should have bail. But the DPP did a big dance up and down about how I had to report to the police 3 times a week and all these other restrictions. I mean, it wasn't ideal, but it's better than being in partly 5 by 3 metre cell. So I took the bail conditions, and life was going on. I mean, I got back to my sort of ordinary life. Now, unfortunately, on Friday the 13th, I put a big puncture in my ride-on lawnmower's tyre, and I had to drive down to the coast to get a new wheel. On the way back, I was pulled up by a highway patrolman who said I was driving erratically and he wanted to test me. Right? Since that time, I actually got the video of his little webcam, and there's no driving erratically whatsoever. Anyway, this lying little prick said, blow into this tube, do your breath test, no alcohol. Then he went away with my licence and put it into their card reader. I didn't know it till a few weeks ago, but there's a thing called the cops computer, C-O-P-S, you know about that? It's a database the cops have on just about everyone, but you're not allowed to check what's in it. Anyway, I got to find out what's in my cops database because it was presented at the bail application as a reason not to let me out. It says that I'm prone to carrying knives and guns and I can assault police at any moment. I've been known to stand over and intimidate police. There's 30 negative entries about me on the cops computer, right? It turns out the knife thing is interesting. When I was arrested in 2005 and 30 armed cops turned up at the little farm at Dungog where we had the hemp crop, it's true, I had a little penknife on my belt that I used to use to cut the loosened bales open, right? And that was recorded as prone to carrying offensive weapons, right? The guns came out because there was 3 empty gun cases under my bed. I'd already handed in my gun licence sometime before. But because there was 3 gun cases there, they were empty this time, but they might not be empty next time, right? These people are really, really fucked up. I mean, you have to say that. Anyway, they use this cops computer as, no, seriously, mate, as a reason for being a menace to society. That's the exact word they use, a menace to society. Right? I mean, I take my civic duties fairly seriously. I probably take my civic duties more seriously than the majority of people in this country. The civic duty is to do as much good as you can in your life before your life runs out. I take that very seriously, right? And I'm offended. Yeah. No, I'm offended to be called a menace to society, but if it's their society, well then I'm happy to be a menace of it. Or to it, whatever one does to be. Anyway, so long story short, I was pulled over by this guy. He ran off, saw I was on bail on a major cannabis charge, or he probably knew anyway, got 30 warnings about how dangerous I was, and then came back and said, I want to search your car. Now, I was working up on a farm at that stage, and as it turns out, I had a machete that was about this long in the back seat. Anyway, he opened the car and started looking. He pulled out this machete and sort of held it up. He said, what's this? Like this. Luckily, on my front seat, because I'd gone to get some spare parts for my ride-on mower, I had these 42-inch mower blades. Right? And I pulled them up and sort of... I said, what about these, officer? And it sort of embarrassed him enough to put my machete down. And we put the blades on top. Then he went through my personal bag, and there was a 25ml bottle, and I stress that 25ml bottle of medical, you could say it was medical cannabis oil. It had a leaf on it and it had things like that, and there was oil. And he said, well, what's this? I'm old enough now not to chat with police when they're in the process of arresting you. And so I made a non-committal statement. I said, we use that topically for children. Right, without saying what it was, where he says, well, I'm arresting you for possession of cannabis. I said, there's nothing illegal here. I said that to him a couple of times, more out of bravado than fact. I mean, as it were, the car did have a substantial amount of product, but they missed it during their search, which is good because things could have been a lot worse for me. But anyway, the paddy wagon arrived, I was thrown into it and carted off. Now, it's interesting, I mean, they at least had the decency to allow me one phone call before they stole my phone. A lot of times you don't get that phone call. So it's very much just like being rendered. You know, you talk about the rendering of people to Guantanamo Bay, where you're walking along the street one day, you're bundled into a car, and you wake up in a prison somewhere in a dark room. It's very much like that. I was lucky. I mean, I convinced him that I could have one phone call or a text, so I texted the family to sort of let it out. Without that, it's a very isolating position to be under arrest when no one knows where you are, people may be waiting for appointments, all sorts of things happen. You're just suddenly plucked from this existence and put into a metal cage, right, with no one who will talk to you. Right? And this business about you've got a right to talk to a lawyer and things, they usually laugh at you when you say that. Right? You might wait 48 hours to get some dead shit legal aid solicitor that doesn't give a stuff about your circumstances, but that's really the best you can actually hope for. Anyway, from Wyong, I was immediately refused bail by Magistrate Feather, which is interesting. I'll come back to Magistrate Feather. He's redeemed himself in my eyes. He refused me bail because they basically said, look, he's a recidivist on massive cannabis charges and he's a menace to society. Right? So these people make major decisions about your life and they know nothing about the case, right? They've just done on what the police say. And when they made what they call a fact sheet, right? They listed all the charges that I've had, not the convictions. So all the charges were listed as convictions. But I've won much more than 3 out of 4. I've been charged like dozens of times, and I've won the majority of them. But they listed them all as though they were all proven. You know, assault police, this is where all the cops things come from. I mean, I was up here at Nimbin when I stood up for a little Aboriginal family and got arrested for obstructing police. I won all those court cases, but it was recorded in the cops' computer as assaulting police. Right? It's a very bizarre system. Anyway, off I went to Cessnock Jail. Right? Cessnock Jail is a publicly run jail. As unpleasant as Parklea was, Cessnock was probably more unpleasant because they had this group of thugs called the Squad. Right? The Squad is a bunch of, I mean, I don't want to be too sort of pejorative about it, but low IQ dross, right? Bottom of the stack dross, usually broader in the shoulder than the mind, right? And they'd wander around the jail dressed in these assault suits. We called them Ninja Turtles because they carried these backpacks front and back. The front had the taser and the baton and this and that and the other thing. I eventually ended up working in the print shop. So we printed out a list of the hardware that the Ninja Turtles carry. They had 3 types of hand grenades that they carried around the jail regularly. They had the tear gas, the stun guns, the smoke grenades, all sorts of things. And I never actually was in the middle of a tear gassing, but 2 days before I got admitted, the whole pod had been tear gassed because of one person pushing one police person. Right? So if there's any sort of disturbance whatsoever, the usual guards withdraw and the Squad come running in, often with snarling dogs. That's the other thing they did. We had plenty of cell searches. So you're minding your own business during your 1 hour off or your 1 hour in the common area, and suddenly snarling dogs and maybe 20 or 30 thuggy sort of cops arrive, and everyone has to sort of put their hands up like they're in some, you know, and get patted down and have the dogs run over them. Then they go into your cell one at a time, and if you give any smart answers, your few paltry possessions and your valued sort of bric-a-brac or whatever you may have is all dumped on the floor and stomped on, or taken, right? And if you give any lip at all, you're likely to be carted off in handcuffs for a good beating, right? I mean, I gave a little bit of lip to one of the Squad. I mean, you've got to be careful, you've got to know when to shut up. So just a little bit of lip. And the prick started handcuffing me and pushing me around. And I said, oh, I'm glad, just smile for that camera up there because the barrister's going to be requesting the CCTV footage. And that sort of pulled him into line a bit. And we actually did get, and this is interesting, this was the one good thing that happened, we did get a legal letter formally complaining about unnecessary violence and requested the CCTV footage. The governor of the jail turned up at my humble little cell the next morning to make sure I hadn't been injured, and I was escorted to the clinic to be looked at. And from that time onwards, to be fair, the Squad never gave me another moment of trouble. Right? So I spent a fair bit of time with the prisoners saying, just use as an example, don't take anything as though you have to. Don't fight back, but push back constantly. But the trouble with most of the prisoners is they're dispirited. Right? It's a very strange population on remand. Now, I call them prisoners and not criminals because there was hardly any criminals. Like, of the hundreds and hundreds of people I met, right, I met one murderer, right? And he was a really nice guy. I mean, I let him cut my hair, you know. He didn't even and there was a few armed robbers. There was plenty of armed robbers, right? But all the rest, this is a maximum security jail, were things like technical AVO breaches. And the AVO system is being brutally abused by certain women and certainly by the police. Once an AVO's in place, and sometimes the police actually force AVOs into place for non-real violence, not apprehended violence, just a bit of loud language or something where a bit of counselling would have worked very successfully, right? And so once you've got the AVO, you can breach that by sending a Christmas card, or you can breach that by ringing up or sending a text saying, how are the kids, or something like that. And then the cops go round and said, has there been any breaches? And they go hunting for AVO breaches. Right? So the remand jail had a tiny amount of real criminals. Tiny amount, right? They had a substantial amount of technical AVO breaches, a substantial amount of driving offences. You drive 3 times without a licence, even if you haven't hurt anyone, you're in a maximum security remand situation, right? What's the other ones? The others, they should have been in bloody neuropsychiatric hospitals. I mean, there were poor developmentally retarded people. I spent a fair bit of time writing letters for guys that were in for shoplifting because then he didn't turn up for his court date because he didn't know what a court date was, right? It's bizarre. At $100,000 or more a year, so the 6 months I spent in jail, the government spent more than $50,000, not to mention the legal fees, which would dwarf that. The DPP's legal fees be 4 or 5 times that at this stage with the amount of time they've spent. Right? It's a shambles of a system, and the privatisation of the jails, I'm not very prone to fear, right? But sitting in Cessnock jail and sort of climbing up as high as you can, as far as your eye can see, you can see expansion of the jail. And day and night, the humming of machinery as they're doubling the size of this jail. They've now created 3 jails where there was 1 before, right? And coupled with the crowding of the prisoners, instead of having 1 or 2 to the room, you have 2 to 3 to the same room. The occupancy is 100%. Often, if I was in a 2-out cell and my cellmate would be sort of put in handcuffs and dragged, say, to Kempsey Jail, I thought, oh, great, I've finally got a bit of space to myself. 2 hours later, the next prisoner's in there. Right? The beds would never cool off before the next prisoner arrives. Occupancy is more than 100%. When I first got to Cessnock Jail, I was in the holding cells because they didn't even have a cell to put me in. Right? That's how crowded these things are. Things are completely out of control. Right? That's my experience of that. The legal system is atrocious. Right? I mean, Steve, I hope there's Steve Bolt still in the room. I'll say it in front of you, Steve, but they say, have you got a good lawyer? And I say, is there such a thing? Right? I mean, they're so brutally corrupted by the system they work in. Right? I mean, what we need are intelligent, activist, socially minded, legally literate people, but they don't exist within the law profession. Only yesterday I was given legal aid to run my court case in November because legal aid took the view that it was a public interest case. But they gave me 2 absolutely dead-headed losers, right? For 3 months I've had a list of people I wanted subpoenaed, and I thought you can leave it up to these professionals and they'll prepare the case for you. A week ago I said, how are those subpoenas? I want to see them. Oh, we haven't sent them out yet. Right? I said, why haven't we had a conference to plan our defence? Oh, we're not going to have a conference because they haven't given us enough money to have a conference with you. You got it? Right, so I'm running the case myself. But whilst I was in jail, I had 4 bail applications. People very generously supported me with GoFundMe and stuff like that. But 2 cases run by the barristers lost. The 2 cases I ran myself, I won. Right? So I'm very, very comfortable running the November case myself. Right? And in fact, I find it... Yeah. Actually, I'll stand corrected there. Right? I don't want to run it myself. I want to speak on my own behalf with the support of the thinking public. because we do want people in Downing Centre Court November the 5th as silent witnesses to what's going on. And what's going on? The New South Wales government are knowingly and intentionally damaging the brains of sick children, right, to serve their corporate masters. You can't put it any clearer than that, right? They're selling the children... Thanks, mate. Thanks. They're selling the children into permanent brain damage because they want to maintain the allopathic profits. Or they're so ideologically driven, they think they're right despite the facts. Now remember that little saying, everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. Right? The facts in this case are very, very clear. Medical cannabis is life-saving. Right? Hemp foods are life-transformative. Right? The reality is most common diseases and severe diseases like autism, asthma, allergies, autoimmune diseases are becoming more and more prevalent. Right? I mean, there's an old saying about the warning voice will go on and no one will actually pay attention till the train finally hits them and then it's too late. Right? Are you all clear on the issue with autism? 30 years ago, autism was a rarity. Right? A rarity. A novelty. An occasionally seen thing. I wish that was the case today. Right? It is far from that. More than 1 in 100 kids, and probably a lot more if you include a broader spectrum, are seriously being brain afflicted by factors that the allopathic medical system not only won't recognise but won't even talk about. Right? Now, my bail conditions, how did I end up getting bail? Court of Criminal Appeal, you appear before 3 judges. Right? And when you walk into a Court of Criminal Appeal, or although this was on was it an AVL? Gee, I've forgotten whether it was on television or reality. I'm starting to deteriorate. Anyway, you get these 3 judges in red robes with this white fur. It looks like you're in Satan's coven, mate. It's really hard to take this stuff seriously. I mean, these people haven't evolved morally since the 1700s and the 1800s, where they sent people away for 14 years for stealing a loaf of bread to feed their family. That's the moral level we're dealing with. That's why I feel it's not only reasonable but obligatory to take firm action even if you have some temporary setbacks in your own life. In fact, I can't say that I've had major temporary setbacks, right? I mean, you'd have to look at these things as life experiences, and even though I don't want them repeated at all because of the time wasting, the time incarcerated was a very valuable time. Just as the time years ago that I spent as a patient in hospital was a very valuable time, because I learnt that most doctors are stuck-up pricks that don't really care about the person lying in the bed in any meaningful way, and there's no real communication, no real empathy or understanding. You only get that when you're at the wrong side of the bed, I'll tell you. So experiences may be somewhat painful, but if you can spin them right, they won't be negative. Okay? How's the time going there, eh?
You've got 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Did you drag up that Billy Bragg song, anyone? I'll have to...
I think I wasn't going to stop you.
Oh?
But I think we should wind it up in a few minutes.
Yeah, okay. We'll do questions.
Yeah, and then I'm going to introduce you to Sue, the local Greens candidate here, and then Karen Verge from the Cannananas, who's going to talk about all the stuff you're not allowed to talk about.
Yeah, I don't do not allowed very well, I'm afraid.
I know.
But yeah, that'll do.
He has strict bail conditions, and we're going to edit the footage before it goes on the web. But you guys are privileged.
No. The bail conditions are I'm not allowed to talk about, not allowed to give advice about medical cannabis. Or health, medical cannabis and health. But I mean, that's nonsense. We've got 2 weeks to go. They'll fade away. I have no real concern.
Yeah. Sue's a lawyer, by the way.
See if I can play that?
I left out a little bit. You remember I said I was arrested up at Wyong with the 25ml bottle. When I got to Wyong police station, the little pricks weighed it. It weighed 76 grams. So I was charged with the possession of 76 mils of cannabis oil. Yeah, no, go on. That just.
Do you want me to play?
Yeah, play.
Right, here comes the Billy Bragg.
Bit of light relief.
Actually, just talk for a sec. Just talk for 2 more seconds.
Yeah, so they routinely do that. They weigh whatever drug they've confiscated and include the container. Right, seriously. As it turns out, the cannabis oil I was arrested with was the CBN oil. It was part of an experiment I was doing in cooperation with some American...
You knew I would spend my time awaiting trial in jail. I said there is no justice, as they led me out the door. The judge said, this isn't a court of justice, son. This is a court.
Won't do karaoke, I'm not good at it.
They first sent me to Windsor,
Let's go, Sista.
then to Stoke-on-Trent. In a holding cell in Liverpool, 3 days and nights I spent. My solicitor can't find me. My family don't know.
Come on, let's go. Better get on with it. Kill it.
That I'm innocent. So come on, son, in you go.
Go on YouTube it yourself, it's a great story. The bottom line is you don't turn criminals into citizens by treating them this way. I'll end with this thought. In Norway, where they run jails on humane lines and the prison officers wear shirt and tie and no weaponry at all and are often spending one-on-one time with the prisoners in their cell, the prisoners get to prepare their own food, they get access to a library, computers, the whole lot. Their recidivist rate is 20%. Right? In this country and in America, the recidivist 5-year rate is 80%. Right? If that's not a lesson, someone has to learn that and fairly quickly. Yeah.
Anyone not know what recidivist means? It means going back to jail. So 80% of the people in jail in Australia are back there within 5 years. It's crazy.
It's a rotating door. It's a rotating door, but it's absolutely unnecessary. Right? We're intentionally creating a permanent criminal class to maintain the employment of a permanent criminal class. Right? It's not a laughing matter.
It's business.
It's business as usual,
Business.
mate. That's what they're doing. We'll do 1 or 2 questions. I'll let it go.
I'm taking him out. So it's serious business. That jails have become business. The drug laws have become business, I realise. 50% of arrests for drugs are cannabis. Most of the arrests, most of the police work is drugs. The jails are mostly drug victims of the drug war. It's serious business. And privatising the jails, 80 grand to keep someone in jail, I think. And I remember Jack Herer telling me years ago, this was the American, trying to change the laws 20 years ago, the biggest contributors to stopping it were the jail guards union. And that's how powerful jobs are. I'm not sure what Andrew talked about. A couple of things I want to mention related. Lots of people are coming to Nimbin looking for medical cannabis now. No one seems to be worried about it being illegal. And in fact, you only get a caution. And bless the New South Wales Police, they are using some discretion now. But the fact is, when you tell people, oh, you might lose your licence, they don't use it. And roadside drug testing is just a shocking thing. And I'm going to introduce you now, just before we talk to Karen, to the local Greens candidate, Sue Higginson. Sue's an old mate of mine. I don't think she smokes pot anymore, but she knows all about it. You stay there, Andrew.
Yeah, you stay there. I'll just...
And I invited her out here today just to meet you guys, introduce you, because of the 3 major parties, the only one doing anything are the Greens. I'm totally cynical about the other parties. They're both carrying on like we've legalised medical cannabis, but I assure you the gate is so narrow, you've got to be on your deathbed to get legal medical cannabis now, with lots of forms. Most doctors can't be bothered. There's a new company formed to fill out the forms for you, but you'll be very lucky to get it. So, it's in the pharmaceutical companies and the police's interest in making sure we can't drive with any cannabis in our system. And it's uniquely fat-soluble. It can stay in your system for a month. You can certainly read positive in saliva for maybe a week, certainly the next day. So it's got big, wider consequences, roadside drug testing, and we're trying to get it together to take them on, but Sue can talk to you about it. I think the Greens are one people who might challenge it, and there's certainly someone who's going to, I hope, question the whole war on drugs, which for me, I've boiled it right down, it's about people wanting to feel good, have less pain, about feel good, and the word God and good come from the same word, gad. It's a little bit for you today. Okay, Sue. Sue is the local Greens candidate, going to, I reckon she can do it. I've known her a long time. We're very supportive of her. She's a champion.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks, everybody. I won't speak for very long, but the story of the good doctor here is one of those really foul stories of injustice. But I am also going to tell the good doctor that I am the exception to his belief. I am actually a good lawyer. There you go. So I actually did start my legal career working with the good lawyer Steve Bolt, who was here earlier, as a young person. After growing up, really mostly my real education happening here in Nimbin and living in the hills here, and with all my good friends and elders, and learning really about what real justice is and what real injustice is. And so I took my career really into the sphere of environmental law, and I've been working as a public interest environmental lawyer for quite a long time. But I too have found myself in the back of a paddy wagon when I was trying to protect old growth forests around here. And I've seen how that injustice just gets perpetrated, and the cycle of dysfunction of our legal system. So after taking up a career working for public interest environmental law and taking on mining giants like Adani, Rio Tinto, and I've won in the courts. I've beaten them. I've taken them to court on behalf of wonderful community groups, and we've won. And then the very bittersweet reality of some victories is I've won in the courts, and then the Parliament's changed the rules so that they can maintain their dysfunctional justice system or their fossil fuel arrangement, the arrangements that they have with their fossil fuel friends. So I decided that something I will do next is I will stand for this area, and I will get myself into the New South Wales Parliament. And thanks. But a lot of people have completely given up on government, and I understand why. There is such a clear reason to give up on government. The problem is, for all of us, is the stakes are just too high to give up. The reason being is it doesn't matter how well we do, and no matter how hard we work on the outside of the system, they will keep getting in the way of our successes. Every time we win, they will change the rules and make it harder for us. So we need to be, and when I say we, the good, reasonable, thinking people, we need to be everywhere. I'm willing to go to that place and I'm willing to carry our banner and our charge in the New South Wales Parliament. We need significant legal reform. On the front line of the legal system, and I can see how it's dysfunctional. We need to get drugs, all drugs, out of that legal system. They do not belong there. So Richard Di Natale last week, the leader of the Australian Greens, stood in the Commonwealth Parliament and said, we're not talking about decriminalising of cannabis, it's time to legalise this thing and get on with doing the work. Particularly influenced, obviously, by the benefits of and the proven benefits of medical cannabis. But more so, we need to get all drugs out of the criminal justice system. There is no place for them. We've seen how dysfunctional that system is at dealing with drugs in the system. It doesn't know how to respond. We need to get them out. One cunning plan that I want to let you all in on, my big secret, is that right now in New South Wales, we actually have, in this region, a once-in-a-generation opportunity. There are currently 3 Greens members in the New South Wales Lower House. The Greens have been an incredibly growing force for decades and decades in Australia and in New South Wales. We currently have 3 Greens members of the Lower House. We add Lismore on March 23 next year. That means 4, assuming we retain and work hard to retain those 3 other seats. The Barrajiklian government is on the nose. The coalition government has never won 3 consecutive terms since 1971. The Foley opposition party is not that well liked in the sense that we still know the Eddie Obeid and the corruption, because the 2 major parties still take corporate donations and donations from the gambling industry. The Greens is the only party that doesn't do that. So, are you starting to get the picture? The Labor Party don't get quite their 13 seats, they get their few. The Barrajiklian government loses seats, the Greens have 4. We get to hold the balance of power, and we get to make some significant changes on really important policy areas and accelerate some of that change. Unstable government, or government where the balance of power is not held by one of those old parties that still gets major donations from fossil fuel companies, the gambling industry, etc. We are a different force, and we can hold them to account. So I'm putting my life and my weight into that right now. I want to take my knowledge that I radically obtained here in Nimbin throughout this beautiful Northern Rivers region, and I want to get in there and try and make a difference. But I can't do it without the support of everyone. So between now and March, I'm asking everyone. I'm sure there are things about the Greens that we don't think is perfect. There's certainly things I don't think that is perfect about the Greens. But in terms of being strategic to get justice outcomes, we have got this incredible opportunity together. So I've opened up a campaign headquarters in Lismore. I'm there as much as I can be on Molesworth Street. Come and talk to me about your issues. If there's things that you don't, that you want to see me doing better, come and talk to me. But let's get involved so that we can make this project, we can bring some more justice to this project, and we can speak some truth to power, and we can stop the hideous injustice that our good doctor here has been carrying on his shoulders for so long. Let's give it a go. In the lower house, so in my game, in the one I'm putting my skin in the lower house in New South Wales, you do whatever you want with your preferences. Nothing I say or do, your preferences are your control. All I'm saying is vote 1 for me.
Don't you have to fill out every square?
In New South Wales, in the lower house, it's currently optional preferential voting. It's up to you.
You just put 1.
You can put 1 if that's what you want to do, and it's a completely lawful vote. 1 Sue Higginson.
So she's a classic Nimbin dreaming story. Here we are, we're going to control New South Wales Parliament soon. So she was with the Environmental Defenders Office, and one of the reasons I think Sue will be great is she spent lots of time in Macquarie Street seeing how the system works. And it would be a nightmare for me. So I think it's true what she said. We've got to make sacrifices a bit in these times. We are the rich kids of the planet. We kind of all know that. So, it's an old biblical thing. To whom much is given, much is expected, and it's a bit true. So I love that you're giving it a go. She has a real chance of winning, and she's a beauty. They're rare. Beauties are rare.
Just a question directed at Sue. I mean, we do wish you victory, obviously, not only in March, but beyond March. But there's been some really encouraging words coming out of different parties, the Liberal Democrats especially. Are you working on building a coalition amongst the independents and the minor parties directed especially at cannabis law reform?
Look, we are owned by no one, we owe nobody any favours, and we are free to work with whoever we choose to get policy outcomes. And that's what we're based on. We are that party with a proven history of, we look at evidence, we look at science, we look at where reform can happen, we're strategic, and absolutely we will work with anyone that is offering real collegiate effort to actually get real law reform, especially when it comes to justice projects. And I see this one as a major justice project. It's time out. We've just got to bring justice into the drug project, and we've just got to get it out of law and order. And, you look at what Richard Di Natale has been speaking about and the effort that he's been making to just try to actually build bridges and alliances to educate people about the time is overdue. We need to move this project because of the impacts it's having at every level of society. The unwellness of young people because of the criminalisation, the lack of opportunities where real remedies are offered to people unwell. And something you said that I think is something I've only recently learned about the major onset of autism amongst young people, epidemic levels. So I recently had the benefit of working with some regenerative agricultural academics. The entrance into our agriculture and food production world of Roundup, to the extent that we know it, and graphs on the same page, is outstanding. So in that sense, you know, we need to be looking far more widely about what we are putting in our bodies holistically, whether it be medicinals, our foods, our systems, our structures, the chemical use, the control that our systems that feed us have is catastrophic at the moment. So we need to open this up. There is so much education in this area because of the Injustice Project that we can apply across. So not just our medicinal well-being, but also in our food production systems and our fibre production systems. This is where the present and the future really is. So the short answer is absolutely, we will work collegiately.
Yeah, we've poisoned the place. We talked about it earlier. We've totally poisoned the place. I really want to thank Sue for being here. And Karen's here. Karen Burge from the Cannon Annas is going to talk to you a bit about... Andrew works a lot from